thought I'd focus in this talk, you all hear me? Yeah. I thought I'd focus in this talk on the story primarily, and right at the end, I'll move to the film. Okay. The Wind Blows is an odd story, not least because when we start it, we're immediately told we've arrived too late. This is normally an impossible thing to do in a story because stories normally begin where the words begin on a page, at the moment that it becomes possible to read. We can be late for the cinema, but that's because the film projector doesn't need us to turn up to start working. The images can begin to be released, and the sound can begin to be transmitted without our being there, so that when we arrive, we catch up with the machine. But in a story, we read at our own pace, and it would be weird to feel we needed to catch up with ourselves. Yet, that's exactly how we're made to feel in this story. Katherine Mansfield's second sentence is, "Something dreadful has happened." And suddenly we find we've fallen behind before we've even started. At the end of the first paragraph, we're told, "It is all over." We never learn what it is that's all over, and there is no time to explain. It's as if we've missed not just the beginning of the story, but the opportunity to understand it, as if arriving late were arriving too late, beyond the point of return. The feeling that we can't go back, can't rewind, slow down, and figure out what's going on gets rechanneled in the story into the main character Matilda's sense that she doesn't have time to prepare for her piano lesson. She's woken up too late. The lesson's at 10. Her hair's a mess, and yet off she goes. Her mother calls out, "Come back immediately," and she says, "I can't come back, I'll be late." When Matilda arrives, she's on time, just as in a way we're on time to start this story because we start reading at the first word. But Matilda still feels that she can't keep up, just as we feel we can't catch up. Her heart is beating too quickly. The girl before her seems to finish too soon. She finds herself in tears on the piano teacher's shoulder, and then he says he wants her to play Beethoven allegretto, briskly. It's as if, though it's her fingers that are on the keys and her heart that's beating, she's not in control of the speed of either her music or her pulse. She can't catch up with herself. There's a strong wind blowing all this time that's been blowing from the start, and this explains to an extent why it feels as though the story begins before we begin reading it. When Matilda wakes up in the story's first paragraph, at the point where we too start reading, there's a metal rod banging against the window, and a whole newspaper hangs in the air like a kite. The wind has been at work already, without her, and without our consciousness to accompany it. It has woken up first. Something that the wind has in common with cinema is that its way of acting is to move. Films need to be projected at a speed of 24 frames per second to be experienced as films, and the wind, by definition, is air in movement. It comes from the Sanskrit for "it blows," so in a sense, Mansfield's title, "The Wind Blows," may read like tautology, the repetition of the same idea twice, like the wind winds or the blow blows. The story is cinematic, feels like a film, not just because it starts before we arrive on the scene, but because its way of starting without us is to move without us. The Wind is a film we're late for, and Matilda's late too, although she's the star. Her rhythms and speeds should be hers to control, but they aren't. It's as if they belong not to her, but to the weird cinematic world she finds herself in. Her rhythms are the medium's rhythms. There is another pre-cinematic literary medium we could associate with uncontrollable speed too, nonsense. When Matilda and her brother Bogey head out for a walk in the second half of the story and find that they cannot walk fast enough, I was reminded of Lewis Carroll's nonsensical accounts of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. In Wonderland, Alice spends her time walking up to and starting conversations with characters who are moving slightly faster than she is, who walk off before she has finished with them. Neither Carol's Alice nor Mansfield's Matilda can catch up with the worlds where their authors put them. A predicament that Carol's character, the Red Queen, understands is a kind of nonsensical law of physics. She says, here it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to run somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. Mansfield actually uses the word nonsense in the story, just before Matilda's walk with her brother Bogey. The context is that Matilda tries to remember a poem addressed to the wind. The poem she thinks of is Percy Shelley's The Cloud, which she remembers as having the line, "I bring fresh flowers to the leaves and showers," which strikes her as nonsense. The obvious reason why this line sounds like nonsense to her is that she gets it wrong. What Shelley actually says is, "I bring fresh showers to the thirsting flowers," which makes sense. But the whole poem is also nonsense in a more fundamental way because she chooses the wrong poem. It isn't Shelley's The Cloud that's addressed to the wind, but his ode to the west wind. Why doesn't she remember the right poem or the right line? I have two theories about this. One is that, like Carol's Alice, she can't think straight. The wind gets in the way. My other theory is that if she were to remember the correct poem by Shelley, including it would change the whole tone of the story. Shelley's poem is about feeling empowered, bolstered, heartened by the wind. Rather than telling us that the wind is too fast, that he can't keep up, it's as though Shelley wants to absorb the speed of the wind into his poem and harness its power. He ends the poem by asking the wind to enter him and become him. This is a quote from the poem. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou mine, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter, as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? That last line is famous. It's everywhere on Twitter at this time of year as the countdown to spring begins. But we tend to forget that in Shelley's original poem, the rhetorical question at the end isn't just meant to be comforting, but to assert Shelley's rhetorical power to influence the course of events. The idea is that if your words are equivalent to the wind, if they have the force behind them to scatter everywhere, turning your verse into a universe, you can affect change, even seasonal change. Mansfield writes towards the beginning of her story, "Summer is over. It is autumn. Everything is ugly," to which Shelley might have responded, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" In Shelley, it is almost as though you can turn winter into spring through sheer verbal charisma. There's a lovely moment in one of Mansfield's letters to her friend and long-term, long-distance correspondent, Dorothy Brett, where she announces, "I always feel winter is over in February." It's February 3rd on the day she writes this letter, barely even February, but her optimism is undaunted. Her winter letters to her friend are full of premonitions like this, of imminent springtime, as though, like Shelley, she could will the warm weather to come by wanting it so much. She liked flowers that were wind-resistant too, violets, hawthorn buds, daffodils, primroses, that had, in her words, some special resisting power to the wind. The idea that you could, by willpower, either force a season to change or maintain the summer conditions inside yourself as a secret resource mattered to Mansfield because she had grown up in a much warmer climate than the British one where she spent her 20s and early 30s. When she died at 34 of tuberculosis, she'd been away from her New Zealand home, where the temperature in February can swim up to a summery 18 degrees, for over a decade. When, in the story, Matilda's mother calls out, "Come back immediately," the plea has more poignancy than the narrative lets on, because Mansfield herself couldn't go home to her family. Her illness prevented her. Mansfield's mother, Annie Burnell Beauchamp, died out in Wellington in 1918, 2 years before The Wind Blows was written, without her daughters being able to see her. In a sense, the stories Mansfield spent her adult life writing were a solution to not being well enough to go home. Mansfield writes, "To write stories, one has to go back into the past," and in her story The Wind Blows, she rewinds the clock back to her teen years in New Zealand, where her mother is still alive. Bogey, Mansfield's brother in real life, is available for walks. Mansfield goes back in time, we could say, but she still remains unable to go back in space. Oceans continue to separate her from the climate she knew. The wind, the cold, the perpetual threat of winter, the sense of being stuck in a freezing grey world indefinitely are all characteristic of her British life. She writes in one of her letters that the British summer was nothing more than a lick and a promise. You could will the summer to happen with all the might of Shelley's wind, a wind strong enough, perhaps, to move giant bodies of cloud and shift microclimates. But what you got when summer came would still be meagre. Shelley, when comparing his words to an all-powerful wind, was living in Venice, where the weather norm was, in the words of the cloud, to wake up each day to heaven's bare blue pavilion and the sun's convex gleams bending across it. Mansfield writes playfully in another February letter to Brett, this time dated the 26th and written in Paris, "Why can't I send some of this weather over to you? Can't it be done?" The most frustrating thing about weather is that when it's good, you can't share it, and when it's bad, you can't send it away. You can use your words to take yourself back in time and use your nose too. Mansfield says in another letter, "I always remember by smells." But you can't do anything about space. The climate stays with you unless you can move away yourself. I interpret Mansfield's story, The Wind Blows, as a cinematically and nonsensically framed complaint about not being able to leave England's wind behind or catch up with it, mediated through the memory of being a restless teenager in New Zealand, wanting to leave and not go back. But Mansfield has a trick up her sleeve for the ending of the story. Matilda and her brother Bogey, still on their walk, are looking out at the sea and make out a couple in the distance who could be them. The pair are arm in arm, leaning over the railing of a ship, and the one who could be Matilda is saying, "Look, Bogey, there's the town. Doesn't it look small? There's the post office clock chiming for the last time. There's the esplanade where we walked that windy day. Do you remember? I cried at my music lesson that day. How many years ago? Goodbye, little island. Goodbye." Mansfield here seems to imagine Matilda and Bogey, mid-escape from New Zealand, looking back across the water and reminiscing together about the events of the story, the piano lesson, the walk, the wind, which have all become memories by this stage. At first, we read their conversation as a fantasy, spoken by trapped characters about silhouettes in the distance they think are lucky to be leaving. But as we continue, the words flicker from fantasy into memory, or at least we can't be sure we know the difference between the two. Could Matilda and Bogey really be leaving the island now, as Mansfield herself left for the UK in 1908? Is this wishful thinking, or is it fast forward into the future? We're once again made to feel we are catching up. We've lost track. Has the narrative leapt forward, or are they still stuck where they were and just dreaming? Mansfield uses the story's last words to maximize this ambiguity, writing right at the end, "Now the dark stretches a wing over the tumbling water. They can't see those two anymore. Goodbye, goodbye, don't forget. but the ship is gone now. They, in this quote, could be either the couple in the ship or the pair on the pier. The tumbling water would be visible from either position. Goodbye could be spoken by either couple, and the ship leaves in both scenarios. Has Mansfield succeeded, after all, in making her story travel through space? Have they left for a new climate? The brilliant film you're about to watch takes the conversation on the ship as its starting point, so that we read the whole story as the memory of Matilda and Bogey looking back. They're watching and we're watching, so we're all watching a film in a way, a sequence of moving images from the past. In the film, the wind can be a noise, as it can't be in Mansfield's silent text, and this makes it even more disruptive. In the film, the wind can obscure dialogue, drown plot beneath its hum, as if nothing existed but itself. If the wind is cinematic in the story, it can feel anti-cinematic in the film, or in other words, antagonistic towards, at odds with the endeavour to convey information. But one sense in which the film feels less oppressive than the story is that it takes the weather somewhere else. The wind is a phenomenon of sound effects on a screen ahead of us. It isn't here where we are, but over there. Mansfield couldn't send her Paris spring day to Dorothy Brett, but we can send her wind away with this film. That's it.